All right, well, hello, and welcome, Martin. This is the Betty Eats podcast, and on the program, we talk about how to spot good recipes from not so great ones, and we talk about real recipes created by real people, not AI, and not just thrown up there for a viral recipe. But today we have Martin Sorge, who, well, some of you may already know Martin because he's kind of famous. He was the winner of the Great American Baking Show, and he's also a recipe developer and a food writer. You write a weekly newsletter, and you're working on your first cookbook.
hmm
So lots of things to talk about today, and I'm so excited to talk to you. You know, I told myself we're not going to start talking about the baking show right off, but
That's fine. That's fine. Thanks again for having me, and I'm happy to talk about whatever.
well, I recently binged watched this episode 6, and wow, that's like high anxiety in a way. I mean, I love, obviously, I think we're both big fans of the Great British Baking Show, and
hmm
but I don't know, somehow it just was more palpable and real, the
Mm.
stress, you know?
hmm
And so I want to ask you, what possessed you to go, I want to be on this?
Great question. So I've always, I've loved baking for many years, and I loved watching the Great British Baking Show. It really, I watched some reality shows, but not a lot of those competition type
Mm,
shows. But that's one that's really stuck with me. I think that and Top Chef. And I think somebody sent me on Instagram when the Great American Baking Show was casting many years ago, and I said, I love that show. I may as well throw my hat into the ring. And then I didn't hear back the first year I filled out the application, which is very long. And then the next year I heard back and I made it through the audition process, didn't make it on. So I kept just auditioning because the process was fun. And one thing I was really interested in is I love baking. I love challenging myself, but also I really love, baking is very solitary. You're at home, you might have your kids or somebody, a friend over helping you bake, but it's usually by yourself. And it's really fun. I thought it'd be really fun to bake with a group of other kind of baking nerds and folks who are also creative. And that was really the impetus for it was like, that seems fun. For some reason, I didn't think about the stress or the competitive part of it. And so I was like, just kept applying. And then when I got cast, I said, oh, okay, I guess we're doing this. And I
wow.
just went into it with the idea of not trying to win because you don't win a cash prize or anything. Just try to have fun and enjoy the experience and try to push myself and do the best I can. So kind of all those things at once, not worrying too much about the cameras or the stress of, doing better than somebody else.
Right. Yeah. And, I think that would be so interesting because, like you said, you love baking, but then there's all these other layers that are added onto that. Like, oh, what
Mm-hmm.
if this is asking me questions? Like,
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something I actually enjoy too. I'm a person who, I like to talk about what I'm doing. I am more than happy to chat while I'm baking. Ask me, like, please tell me why you're doing this, like, why you're, about this fruit you're using to make jam or about the process to make this sponge. I'm a nerd. I can talk until you tell me to stop, which happened oftentimes on the show. And like at home, my husband, I'm like, I have quince. Do you know why quince are great? Because they have really high pectin content. He's like, I don't really care. Is the thing you're making done yet? Can I eat it? So it was a fun time where I got to talk with folks. And that really, as part of being on the show, that part of it's not for everybody, but it was definitely for me and my other castmates.
wow, wow. And I just learned this recently that you guys actually flew to England. So
Mm-hmm.
it was filmed in England.
Yep.
And I was reading an article actually that someone had interviewed you and you were talking about, and I didn't think about this either, how British ingredients are slightly different. Like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
it's flour, but British flour is a little bit different than American flour. So
Mm-hmm.
you're also making these adjustments.
Yeah, that was tough. It was fun. We had you get there and you realize you go to a different country, the ingredients might look the same, but there's always slight little difference. Like, is there higher butter fat content? Is the flour different in terms of its gluten properties? And I'm a nerd about those things, but you don't really know until you're there. But the biggest difference I always tell is people is they have the most beautiful dairy products. And they have like a million different kinds of cream. They have single cream and whipping cream and double cream, which is my favorite ingredient. And I wish in the US we had double cream, but it whips up in a second. And so if you start whipping it and you walk away, it will turn to butter. But it's very stable. It almost tastes more like butter than cream sometimes. But that was the one that kind of threw us for a loop. But I had one cake where I topped it basically with whipped cream, and at home it was like, on the verge of being unstable. But that double cream just held up perfectly. So I was like, oh, this works. But we all had to adjust our recipes a little bit based on some of those ingredients and some of the differences we had. And then we also learned some things like, in America here, when you ask for cornmeal, like we have, of course, polenta, or kind of what I think of classic kind of medium grind cornmeal, which I use a lot here in the Midwest, and I love cornbread. And then we have like you can get more finely ground corn flour. They really have like cornstarch or polenta and not really anything in between. So some of those things you're like, oh, this is not something they have here, which I never even thought about.
Oh, yeah. Well, and this is kind of funny. This is on a much smaller scale, but I was spending the weekend with some girlfriends and we had rented a house. And so we were doing some cooking and whoa, using another oven.
I think so. I wrote a piece for Food and Wine about how, you're so used to your kitchen. You know what is in your drawer that's just crammed full of, utensils and things, but you're like, oh, I know that offset spatula's in here and I know exactly where I usually stick it. But you're in a new kitchen, you don't know where things are. Your oven is completely different. All your tools are a little bit different. And you have to really rely on your senses and kind of slow down. But that's the big thing. The oven's cooked a little different. And one time I smelled something and I was like, ooh, that smells done, but there's 10 minutes left on the timer. And then I looked and I said, oh, it's done. So you
Wow.
have to really pay more attention. And there's a lot of distractions. There's cameras, there's, your friends baking in front of you and you want to see what they're doing. You're outside, you're like, oh, bunnies. So you really have to kind of focus and like rely on those instincts and skills you've developed over the years to say, oh, nope, this smells done. The timer hasn't gone off, but I know I got to take it out.
Yeah. So you're kind of relying on other things other than just, like you said, what you normally think of like, oh, I know this takes 40 minutes in my oven.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's one thing as I'm writing recipes, I always like for doneness, I include the indicators first because like everyone's oven is different, their ingredients might be slightly different.
Mm.
Don't just rely on this time because like I had an old oven that was way off in terms of temperature and things always baked way faster. And so I tell folks that's another reason you look at a good recipe. So like this will take exactly 7 minutes. And I'm like, will it take 7 minutes? Like what rack is it on? What is your oven like? Do you have the exact same types of flour? Are you weighing your ingredients? So that's always why you're talking about, good recipes. One is really you have to give a couple indicators when it's done because wish I didn't even have to put times in there because it's really, you have to use your senses to determine those things.
Yeah. Yeah. I really love that reminder. I know I started putting on recipes 30-ish minutes. I don't,
Mm-hmm.
because like
Mm-hmm.
you said, like so many things are different and, stovetop burners are different and those can, but I love your idea of using indicators. Like it should look like this or it should have a golden, crust or
Mm-hmm.
things like that. Yeah. Yeah. That's
Mm-hmm.
great. Well, do you feel like being on the baking show, did it change your life? Do you feel like it changed your life in a way or what did you
Oh,
think?
it definitely did. It
Yeah.
was, first of all, I think and everybody says this, but it really introduced me to 8 other great friends. The other contestants I was on the show with are all wonderful people. We still stay in touch. We
Wow.
have had an annual reunion where as many of us as can, which is almost everybody, get together. We were in New York City last summer. The year before that, we were in Chicago. We do like an annual, like, little holiday gathering. We have a group text where we share updates about life, but also if somebody's like, baking question, like, what's your favorite recipe for this? Or I'm having a problem with my meringue, we can hop on there and ask those questions. So that was a huge one because, especially as adults, we don't always, get thrown into a group where everybody's just like a lovely person, even those of us with wildly different backgrounds. And then I was spoiled because 2 of the other contestants are from Chicago here. And so I get to go see them once a week or however often I can hang
Oh,
out with them.
goodness.
And so it's like I have 2 new friends here. which is just like I can't talk about how much Sarah and Nerali mean to me now that I can see them all the time. But then also it gave me a lot of confidence in myself. When I went there, the other bakers are all so incredible. I was initially like, oh, I'm not as good as these folks.
Mhm.
One of my strengths is definitely not decorating cakes or cookies. And, the folks in the tent were like, some of them, the artistry they had, I was just like, this is beyond something I could do. But then I realized we all have our own skills and points of view and things like that. So it gave me confidence, and then also gave me confidence that maybe other folks might want to read some of my recipes. And I thought if I ever am going to try to share recipes, because I've always liked writing down my recipes and I would bake something and I would take copious notes and actually try to write a well-worded recipe. I said, if I'm ever going to try to get somebody more than myself to look at these recipes, now's probably the time, and maybe people actually want to read them. So that's when I started to kind of share, because before the show, I thought, like, no, we don't need another voice here. There's so many recipes out there. There's so many great people writing about food and baking. Like, what do I have to add? And then I thought, oh, maybe I do have something to add. And some of my baking show colleagues said, actually, you do. Like, you should go for this if you is something you like doing, because we would make your recipes too.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's such a great point too, because I feel like everybody brings something unique and different and a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of a different twist. And yes, we all love, Dory Greenspan and we all love, Ina Garten and
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, I think that that's awesome to know like, yeah, I do bring something different to this and yeah. And so now this is your full-time career, right?
Yeah, it's I do some other work on the side as well, but this is kind of what I'm, especially because I have a book manuscript due in not too long.
Yeah.
It's what I'm doing all of the my full time right now, kind of taking a hiatus from my previous career to say, hey, if I'm going to try this out for a little bit and see how it goes.
Yeah.
And I'm enjoying it and getting some really fun gigs here. I just shot a photo for Valentine's Day recipe for the Chicago Tribune.
Wow.
It's really exciting and it's fun to share. And I'm surprised how fast I can whip out some good recipes when I need to. I'm like, oh, I have this great idea, and people actually bite.
So you're probably doing a lot of recipe testing right now then, just in preparation for your book. I've
That's
seen
an
a couple of your
understatement.
posts.
Mm-hmm.
It's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh boy, he's knee
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been really busy in the kitchen testing and retesting and tweaking and trying to think of like, when should I stop? When is this good enough?
deep.
Which can be a struggle for those of us who are like, oh, it could be a little better. What if I added this other thing? So that's where I am right now with a lot of recipes, but it's a fun process. I'm spoiled. I was sitting writing up some recipes with one of my cats on my lap the other day. I was like, this is nice. I'm very lucky.
That's so sweet. But so, when people are looking at especially baking recipes, I think we've all made our share of bad viral baking
Yes.
recipes. It's
Oh,
like,
yes.
please stop, TikTok, go away,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
whatever social media. But
Mm-hmm.
what are, I mean, can you look at a recipe now and go, yeah, that's just not going to work? I mean, like, what should people be looking for
Mm-hmm.
when they look at a baking recipe, especially, I mean, any recipe, but especially baking?
So for me, the biggest thing is looking at who's writing the recipe. There are, if you Google chocolate chip cookies, the recipe that comes up first could be the best chocolate chip cookie recipe there is. Or it could just be somebody's blog had perfect search engine optimization so that it comes up on top. It doesn't mean it's the best recipe. It could be a fine recipe. So my rule is like look for an author you trust who's had lots of recipes out there. It could be a blogger who has there's a couple of blogs where I'm like, man, this person, their recipes are always on point and they really test them well.
Right.
But then I have a lot of folks that I go back to because I'm like, I know David Leibovitz's recipe will be great, or I know um, Dan Leppard, who's a British cookbook author who I love. Like, I know his recipes are always really well tested and solid. So I have folks, and it's a big group of folks that I have kind of in my like on my in my mental bookshelf of like I know their recipes are going to be really good. So if I'm looking at another recipe, I can sometimes pick out things if it's like, I don't know this person, but they're the only sometimes I'm looking up an obscure recipe and I'm like, this is the only one I saw. So let me see. And then I'm like, for me with baking, if there's not an option for it in grams in metric weights, I won't make it because that's the most accurate way to bake. I also don't want to dirty measuring cups. I don't want those extra dishes to do. So I only if there's no weights on there, there's both weights and volume, I'll try it. But if there's no weights, I immediately am like, nope, I'm not making this recipe, which a lot of people are the opposite. But I think it's changing because people are saying, oh, it's actually easier to bake with weights and faster. So that's the first one. The second one is reading through the instructions. Are they detailed? Do they give you a sense of the batter should have this consistency? Like I said, the doneness indicator should be this consistency. Do they list temperatures of this, lemon curd should be done at this temperature, or, cook this sugar syrup to this temperature. Those things are really important because I'm a person that I want multiple checks to say, hey, does this person actually really know what they're doing? Or are they copying and pasting from something else? Or are they really great at this recipe? They're just maybe not as skilled as writing it down. Because there's great bakers who aren't necessarily the best recipe writers. I know some folks like that, like, somebody's grandma who's like, makes the best pie, but written down how she makes the pie. She can just show you. She's like, oh, it's this much of this and this much of that. So those are a few things, but really for me, it's looking at certain recipe developers. One of my favorite Substack newsletters is Kitchen Projects by Nicola Lamb. And her, she does all this research where she's like, I tested 5 different ways to make this sponge cake. And here's what the differences all are. And here's the percentages of butter and flour. And then here's my favorite version. And like, clearly she's done her work. And so there's folks like that I really just like bookmark, and I'm like, oh, has this person, if I'm looking to make like I don't know, angel food cake, I'm like, okay, the people I trust the most, let me look at their versions of this recipe, to come up with my own. So that's usually where I stick to it.
And can we go back to the weights measurement?
Absolutely.
This is very, I'm seeing more and more of this, and I think that American bakers really are used to the cups and the
Mm-hmm.
teaspoons and the things like that, and myself included. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
as well. But I am seeing more and more recipes, and I have also made recipes using the measurements. The weights. So can
Mm-hmm.
you talk a little bit about that? Because I know that some people are like, wait, what?
I know
How do we do?
it's one of the biggest and most enthusiastic complaints on recipes that don't have cup measurements. I have no patience for that because a scale is $15 at the store, and it is so easy to measure. Like, I know you might have like your grandma's handwritten recipes that are in cups, and that's great, but it's it's more accurate because flour can range anywhere from like 110 grams to 160 grams when you measure by the cup. Like, are you packing it in there? Have you sifted the flour first? So that's a big difference in terms of the final recipe in what it'll turn out, especially with flour or like lighter and fluffier ingredients. So that's the most important thing. And almost every other country, folks measure in weights. In bakeries, they measure in weights almost exclusively. So it's the easiest thing to do. Now, there's a couple other benefits too in terms of measuring with grams. One is, and I want to like tell everybody this, you'll have fewer dishes to do because you're not cleaning every measuring cup you have. You don't have to, there's all these hacks on the internet of like, here's how to measure sticky ingredients. And I'm like, or you can use a scale and measure it right into the bowl with the other ingredients. And you don't even need a trick for greasing the cup or greasing the measuring spoon. It's like, no, if you need 50 grams of honey, you push the tare button on your scale and you squeeze the honey until it says 50 and you're done. No stickiness anywhere. And the other thing is you can measure stuff all in the same bowl. So you can put your mixing bowl for your mixer on the scale and measure every ingredient in there and then start your process. And then the other thing is if you want to change the quantities, it's much easier. Instead of saying, okay, this was 2 cups and a third cup, and I want to do half of that, so that's 1 and 1, 6 cups. It's like, no, you just have a number there and you just divide it by half. The thing I try to do is anything under a tablespoon, I use tablespoons and teaspoons because a lot of scales aren't that sensitive. And it's like a teaspoon of salt, yeah, you can easily quickly do that. And then I try to keep recipes to like 1 large egg or 1 large egg white. A few times, like if I'm making macarons or something really finicky, I will be like, no, you need to get your scale out for this one. But otherwise, there's a little fudging around. It's like a large egg is going to be pretty close to the same weight, and I'll try to round things to like, if I can make it one full stick of butter, I'll make it one full stick of butter. But I think it's just so much easier, more accurate. You're going to get better results. I was actually writing a section of my cookbook today, and troubleshooting section. And I said, if this recipe doesn't work, go back, and you didn't use weights, go back and do it by weight. It's the first thing to do, because I'm testing these all in weights. I'm having some folks test them using volumes, but I'm not going to test them all using volume measurements. I tell people in the beginning, this is just like a guesstimate. And for some ingredients, I'm not going to tell you cups, because for things like fruit, like how big are your apricots? I can't tell you 2 cups of apricots. You might have these big fat ones or these tiny little ones. You got to use weight for that. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, that is such a good point. I think especially for baking, because it is a science.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, like you were saying, I was reading a recipe the other day and it called for 2 cups of, I don't know, something or other, figs or dates or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, okay, but is that is that chopped? Is that
Mm-hmm.
all squished in there? Is it
Mm-hmm.
pitted already? There were just so many
Mm-hmm.
questions that I had.
Yeah.
So that's a really good point of just if when you go by weights, it's like, well, it is what it is. It's 100 grams or, whatever. For
Exactly. And
how
even
much
things like salt, if you're using different brands of kosher salt or fine
Yeah.
sea salt, which I use, 10 grams of any of those salts will have the same saltiness. So if you can literally just write 10 grams of salt. And if it's a super fluffy light salt, 10 grams of it will be the same saltiness as 10 grams of sea salt. So it kind of prevents any of those differences from mattering if you use weights. And again, I just want to be like, it's also easier. Like, I know you're so used to your cups and scooping the flour out, but I promise you, it's easier to use your scale. Mine lives on my counter.
Those are all such good points. I didn't think about the salt one, but that's really good because I use kosher salt almost exclusively, and
Mm-hmm.
somebody will make a recipe and say, "Ooh, this was so salty," and it's like
Mm-hmm.
use table salt versus
Yep.
kosher.
But if you say, 10 grams, it'll say be 10, it'll taste the same saltiness no matter what salt you use.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Well, so here you are, you're recipe testing for your cookbook. Where do you draw your inspiration from when you are developing recipes? Now, I know that you actually went to Germany and
Mm-hmm.
went to this like dream bread baking school. I was reading about
Mm-hmm.
this and I was like, wow, I mean, that seems like everybody should do that. I mean, that just seemed so exciting. And what made you like? How did you find this, first of all?
So I'll take that last part first. So I want to evangelize the glory that is German bread. I think it's this. So, bread is really important to German culture, also in parts of Switzerland and Austria, northern Italy, where they speak German. It is really a deep part of their culture. It is, bakeries are everywhere. They don't just have one kind of bread, they have this incredible array of breads. You enter a German bakery and it's like carbohydrate wonderland. There's like light, fluffy sourdough, or like the densest, whole grain rye bread, or a spelt and seed loaf, or a bunch of little brötchen, which are these little, they're not rolls because they're crusty, but little breads. A lot of times they have them in the morning, and it can be like a light, crispy one, or a, hearty rye one, or one covered in seeds, and, everything under the sun. They have names like Brotzeit, which is like a morning snack in some parts of Germany, which literally mean bread time, where you have some bread, maybe some meats. The traditional evening meal in Germany, they often call Abendbrot, which is evening bread, where you have slices of bread with some meats and pickles and toppings, and that's a really, a cold dinner is actually very common there. Lunch historically was usually a big hot meal, and dinner was just a light meal served with bread. It's such a ingrained part of their culture that UNESCO's recognized German bread culture as an intangible cultural heritage. There's an article where actually with my friend Prue Leith, one of the judges on the Great American Baking Show, who she said that Germany has the best bakeries in the world. So it's not just me. So I think that the glory of German bread needs more attention. I don't think the Germans tout their own horn when it comes to food or wine or bread or baking. But viennoiserie, which croissants and all those things like that's from Vienna, from this German speaking culture. So it's just like it is so even more so, sorry, anybody who disagrees, more so than like France or Italy, that the bread is out of this world. You talk to a German expat, and if you mention bread, you'll see their eyes start to twinkle and they're like, I miss the bread at home. It is the most common thing I hear that people miss. So that's one thing that inspires me because I've had a few trips to those German speaking parts of Europe. And I just said, the first time I was there, I was like, what, where did this come from? This bounty of this delicious bread, and I can't get any of it at home. So I kind of treated myself and did a 2 week baking class, a bread baking class in English at the National German Bread Academy, essentially, where all the German master bakers have to go and train, which is in like this beautiful kind of forest
Of course
near
it is.
Heidelberg and with wonderful instructors. And it was just a dream for me to learn how to make some of these breads that there aren't many recipes in English. So I'm working on some of those to share at some point. A few will be in my first book. But that's one thing that inspires me is like traveling and discovering flavors. But honestly, it's usually like what am I craving or what flavor entered my brain, or especially living in the Midwest where we have such distinct seasons, like what is in season here. Like people think the fall is baking season. For me, summer is baking season here because it's like, oh, we have rhubarb and now we have cherries and now we have peaches and all those things. So it's usually what's in season is really inspiring me. And then I realized working on this book and being on the baking show that I really like kind of like simple classic flavors with a twist. And I use a lot of whole grains and different grains in my baking. We're in the breadbasket of America here. There's some great local mills in the Midwest that make some delicious flours. And so I don't always stick with white flour in my bread or my cakes or my cookies because I think that's part of the flavor is looking at the grains you're using. So that's something that you'll see in almost all of my baking. Like, oh, there's buckwheat in this cake, or there's, durum flour in this other thing, or I'm using a lot of rye because I love rye so much. And that's another thing that I'm trying to get folks to like say, hey, this looks classic, but there is like this little twist in there that changes the texture or adds a depth of flavor that, you might really love. But it's really still that kind of what's that Midwestern comfort baking I grew up on.
And I think you hit on something too, is that people don't always think about the different types of flours are going to add a different flavor profile. I love rye too.
Mm.
It was funny on the baking show, you had done those like little Pop Tarts, with rye raspberry. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's brilliant because, you take kind of a semi junky, morning pastry treat in America.
Mm-hmm.
But, when you use rye, it's like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
this is a whole different flavor profile and it's healthier because you're not, relying on white refined blah, blah,
Mm-hmm.
blah. So, yeah, that is so interesting. Well, that's great that you have access to like mills and things, but where would you suggest that people get different types of flours? I mean, of course, Amazon, but is there something that you would recommend?
I'd say it depends on where you live. Google if there's any local grain mills or millers around you. There small mills are popping up all over the place
Mm.
from, Arizona, California, Texas has some great ones. I will tout my Midwestern local mill called Janie's Mill, which is in Ashcombe, Illinois, which they're absolutely lovely folks. Aside from making amazing grains, you can order their stuff online. But they started out and it's all organically grown grains, some heritage grains, which are really fun to play with. Beautiful buckwheat flour, which is one of my favorites. So I order a lot from Janie's Mill. But there's, again, a ton around the country. So I'd say see who your local mill is. Some even go to farmers markets in certain places. And so you can see, hey, is there a miller that goes to a farmers market? That way you can ask them about their flours. And the other thing is if baking with some of these, grains from smaller stone mills might work a little different, but most of the mills are more than happy to tell you like, hey, here's what's different about this flour and how you should treat it a little different if you're making bread or something else. So it's a fun exploration for me because I like that aspect. Like I just made shortbread all with buckwheat flour and it just no flavorings added, and it just kind of had a completely different flavor. And that's actually my favorite way of telling people to experiment with flours is make a simple shortbread because the grain will really shine. So if you're going to use like all whole spelt flour, if you make a shortbread with it, don't even add vanilla extract, just make a plain shortbread, and that will be like, oh, this is what spelt tastes like, but with a little sweetness and a little lovely butteriness.
That is a good point. I wouldn't have thought that, but that you can really then kind of get what its flavor profile is by something
Hmm.
simple like that. Yeah. Well, I saw you had posted on Substack a loaf that you had just made. That looked amazing.
Yeah, and that was, I put just 10% buckwheat flour in there, and it made a huge difference in flavor. And so that's, I think, going to be the recipe I'm going to put up this weekend because I was like, this is shockingly good for like this tiny little amount of flour that changed the way the whole loaf tasted.
Right. And maybe that would be, do you think, a good way too for people who love, all white flour is to just
Hmm.
add a little bit and see how it tastes or the
Yep.
change.
So I make like a simple, no knead, not even sourdough loaf, and that's my favorite way to experiment with different flours is add if it's a gluten-free flour, you can add probably up to 10%. But for any other flours, up to 25% to start with. And then you have the same texture of just a, white flour loaf, but you can get that flavor with like, if you're using a certain heritage whole wheat or spelt or something else, it'll help you really get, oh, this is what that flour tastes like without giving you like a heavy, dense bread if it's something you like to make. So that's actually how there's the two main ways I test out flours is through like a simple no knead loaf recipe and or shortbread that both of which I have the recipes in my head, so I don't even need to look them up.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, so you're working on your cookbook, obviously,
Hmm.
and doing tons of recipe testing for that. What else? When does that come out, by the way, your cookbook?
That should be out in 2026.
Right.
Yeah, there's a long ways to
Yeah.
go.
Well, I mean, but that says something that these recipes are being actually tested and not just like, thrown together and let's print a book.
Yeah, and so the actually these recipes are before I was even on the baking show, I was starting to compile some of my recipes that I make a lot. Like there's a loaf of, I call it toast bread. It's a whole wheat loaf of bread, simple, that I make all the time just to eat. Or this breakfast crisp that I make honestly once a week this time of year to eat. So these are recipes that like I just make all the time and I had written down that I'd sent to my sister or some of my friends who were like, hey, can I have this cookie recipe you make all the time? So I'd written a lot of these down. I was going to put together like a little 25 recipe booklet to give to family and friends after actually a couple Christmases ago. I was like, oh, this is what I'll give people for Christmas. And then the show came and went, and I said, oh, maybe there's a wider audience for these recipes. So these are recipes that actually are just the recipes I make a lot. So, like, some of them I have made 40 times, 50 times. So this book, some of these recipes aren't, I'm going to say it, aren't like the most innovative, quirky, unique. I'm like, no, this is just the recipe I make all the time because I love it. And I've adapted it from so and so's bread that I made and like changed 10 iterations of, or this technique that I learned from Nicola on Substack that helped me make this cake a certain way. So these are just recipes that I've had. I haven't shared. These are my favorite recipes I haven't shared on my newsletter. I haven't shared on Instagram because I was like saving them. I'm like, nope, this is, even if it's just a book, even if I'm the only one that buys the book, these are the recipes that I will make again and again. But I'm like, if I make them all the time, I hope other people will too.
So these are your like tried and true. These are like your tried and true, like
Yes, like my pie
always.
crust that I can like you give me butter, flour, and water, like I will have a pie crust for you. I don't need I give me a scale and we can have pie crust. Like I don't need a recipe. I have it all up here. So a lot of those recipes are those particular ones that I've just made a million times. Would hope other people would too.
Yeah. Ooh, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, and some of them are ones I struggled with that I didn't get right for a long time. Like it did take me a lot of years to make good pie crust, and once I figured out my way, I'm like, okay, this is my way, but it didn't come right away.
Yeah, I think that's true. That especially pie crust can be very intimidating. I know I love making my own too, and it's you become a little bit of a like pie crust snob in a way. Like, you know what I mean? You go to a
Hmm.
restaurant and I'll
Hmm.
just eat the innards. I'm like, no, this crust is wrong.
That's me too. I hate to admit it. I mean, I will eat almost any pie, but if I will have notes on the crust. But I even helped, like, my mom's always made great pie, but sometimes she had the dreaded soggy bottom. And I told her, I'm like, here's my trick for, always bake it on the bottom rack of the oven because that way the bottom is closer to the heat. And then when the top is done, the top won't be burnt by the time the bottom is still raw. And she did that. And I was like, Mom, your pie crust is better. And she's like, yeah, I baked it on the bottom rack. And I said, I told you.
Well, I remember one of the posts in your newsletter, you actually had a whole newsletter devoted to like pie crust tips. It was kind of right
Mm,
around Thanksgiving.
mm-hmm. Yep.
I remember reading that. Every single one of those is so good. Seriously, I mean, it makes a
Thank
big
you.
difference, especially
Yeah.
for people who may be like, I'm afraid to make my own crust. But, I think those tips, like you said, they make a world of difference. And
Mm-hmm.
it's little things, that people may not know if they're just unrolling it from Pillsbury. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
not that that's bad, no judgment. But homemade just tastes 1,000 times better.
It does, yeah. And a lot of people, make it once or twice a year for the holidays. And so it's for folks like me who make pie probably too much. No, there's never too much.
Never too
I'm
much.
happy to give these little tips. And some of them are just like easy. Like it's not like, oh, here's like this complicated thing you have to do. It's like, no, just bake it on the bottom rack
Mm-hmm.
and you'll make sure you won't have a soggy bottom. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
I can do that.
Yeah, right, right. Well, what else are you, obviously you're working on your cookbook, but what else are
Hmm.
you just, I don't know, looking forward to this year? Other plans, other travels? You're going to go to another German
I
baking
hope
school.
so. I hope so because I'm still on this quest to bring German bread to American kitchens a little more and to get people over there exploring just the beautiful culinary traditions of a country that doesn't get enough praise for its food. So I'm doing some actually just doing some writing for local publications, a few national publications, some recipes, some other, you know, usually baking or food related writing. I write for Food and Wine, a few recipes, but also some tips about some of my favorite ingredients. So if you want to know about tart cherries or lemon verbena or buckwheat, like I have little articles about them, explaining them that, when they ask me, hey, can you write about buckwheat? I'm like, oh, that's my dream because I love that stuff. I love getting nerdy about those things. So hopefully doing some more of that, doing some more recipe writing. The book is my big focus for the first half of this year and then some. And then I do hope to do a little bit of traveling because, again, I have this newfound addiction to German baking and there's a few things I want to learn or experience or some bakeries I want to visit. So don't have anything planned right now because I'm actually trying to focus this spring where I was like, no more traveling. Yeah, and to just always learn some more. Like I have other baker friends and bakery owners here in Chicago to work with and collaborate. And that's another fun thing about the especially food community is people are really lovely. And when sometimes social media or the news can be a little less than fun to deal with in the world of food and baking, people are just absolutely wonderful. Like I've had people who I've looked up to reach out to me and been like, "Hey, how can I help?" Or if you ever need some advice, I've written a couple books. Lucas Volger, who's a cookbook author who I love, kindly offered me some time to just pick his brain about, hey, what should I look out for in the cookbook process? And so hopefully collaborating with some other folks near and far on the baking front. And yeah.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful. Well, so do you have a recipe to share with the listeners? A tried and true that you would love to share? I can put the link in the show notes.
Yeah, so the recipe I shared last on my Substack newsletter, which I think I call it the Lovely Lazy Loaf. It's
Yeah.
just this really easy, no need, no tools required, like loaf of bread. It's half whole wheat flour, has a bunch of sesame seed. I put sesame seeds, pumpkin seeds, and toasted sunflower seeds in there, so it has a ton of flavor. If you have a sourdough starter lingering in your, on your counter, you can add a little bit of that, but I add some yeast too so that it's reliable. The sourdough starter might gives it a little extra flavor, but it's something you can throw together, before you go to bed. You can bake it the next day and you still have this really flavorful, really inexpensive to make loaf of bread. That's one thing, I got my start making bread. That was how I started baking because it's actually pretty cheap if you mess up, you're wasting flour, salt, yeast, water. So I really encourage people to get in there and make a loaf of bread, especially in the cold Midwestern winter. Like it's the perfect way to like crank up your oven to 450 and warm up the house.
Well, that sounds delicious. I could go for a slice of that right now. Well, as we wrap up, where is the best place for people to connect with you and find you? And I'll put links obviously in the show notes, but where can they find you online?
You can find me on Instagram. That's where I am most at Martin Sorge. And then on Substack, my newsletter is called Great Bakes. So you can find that at greatbakes.substack.com. That's where I share most of my recipes and writing. So I highly recommend you subscribing to that to follow any of my recipes. And then I also have a website at martinbakes.com, which has links to all these things. And I'll also share links to any of my recipes and other publications too.
Great. Well, thank you. It has been such a pleasure talking to you today, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. And I know that people are really going to take what they've learned and bake better.
Thank you so much, Betty, for having me too. It's an absolute pleasure to get to talk to you, and I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you.